everyone to our seminar. We are extremely pleased to have tonight our own Sasha Yarkin as a speaker. Sasha received his bachelor and master's at the Harris School. Now he is a PhD candidate in Brown, Rhode Island. His academic interests are quite diverse. It's political economy, development, segregated societies, economic growth, what else? Tonight, Sasha is going to talk about ancestral shocks and political attitudes of immigrants, evidence from the European Refugee Crisis. I understand that this is a work in progress, but still some quite interesting results. So Sasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Leonid, for this very kind introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. I think Leonid is totally correct in saying that this is a very much a work in progress. I would say like an early stage work in progress. So, you know, any sort of impressions, comments, and suggestions on where this project, you know, can go, which directions are more interesting, in your opinion. So, or just, you know, suggest me to drop it right away if you think it's not interesting. Well, I mean, in any case, let me just start. So, the refugee crisis, of course, was and partly is a very salient event, both at the European and at the global scale. Okay, so here is like a very like you know, toy type representation of this event. So there were like several reasons for this massive inflows of asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants more generally into the European continent, and especially into several countries. Okay, so people were moving through Turkey, Greece, through Italy, partly through Spain and Malta to get to what they thought could be like a safer place to live, like Germany, Austria, Sweden, and several other countries. So as you can see already on this screen, of course, certain countries were, you know, quote unquote, treated by this refugee experience much more heavier than other countries, okay? And also there was a quite an acceleration in these inflows of refugees and asylum seekers in the years of 2014, 2015, and partly 2016, which can be somewhat seen at this graph. Especially it kind of stops here, but you can see that there is like a spike in the inflow of refugees. And so I see something in the chat, right? Should I pay attention to that? Or?
No, it's just people, people are asked to identify themselves. It's a way of registration.
No, Alex, I will let you know if I see any questions, so don't worry about the chat.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. All right. So what I will be trying to explore in this project is basically, you know, like the effects of this refugee crisis in Europe on various economic, social, and political aspects of life is quite broadly explored, okay? So what I'm doing in this project is a different thing. So I'm trying to ask whether, so if a person is living in a place which is not directly affected by the crisis, okay? Say in the US or, you know, in Latvia. So basically there is almost no impact of the refugee crisis in Latvia or the US. Does this person still react to the events and attitudinal changes happening in the most affected countries during this time period if this person traces his ancestry back to this affected country? So for example, imagine I'm a third generation Hungarian living in the US, okay? And then a lot of refugees, you know, swamp Hungary. Okay, they arrive, people are not happy about it in Hungary, not at all actually. And so do I react to this as a third generation Hungarian living elsewhere, say, I don't know, in Latvia or in the US? This is part of the question that I wanna explore in this paper. So are there spillover effects of this refugee crisis? And more generally of these kind of salient events that happen elsewhere, if you have this sort of ethnic and ancestral ties to this kind of affected place, okay? And why do I think this is interesting? Well, oops, slides are not changing. Yeah, here we go. So first of all, I think this can be interesting in the context of this, you know, massive right-wing trends across developed nations. You know, like we have Trump, Brexit, AfD, Sweden Democrats, and all these movements which are kind of gaining momentum in the recent years. And the question is, can part of this trend evolve along these ancestral lines? So in a way, if, for example, this European refugee crisis has affected opinions and attitudes in Europe, say making many people more conservative and stuff, and then if these attitudes spill over to the US, so for example, a natural question can be, can part of the success of Donald Trump can be attributed to this attitudinal changes in Europe, okay? I will try to address this as well, okay? And then I think this project can be like maybe interesting in a more general sense, because I do not think that the literature and the research like in these cultural, political, and growth fields have actually addressed this sort of cultural and political spillovers. So there is, of course, the large literature looking at the, certain so-called like epidemiological approach and second generation migrants analysis, whereby we look at, for example, women labor force participation rates in Italy, in 50s, and we ask, does this labor force participation rates of women in Italy affect corresponding measure in the US? Okay, so this was like the research by Fernandez and Foley, Paulus Giuliano, and other authors who are looking at this kind of cultural persistence. But what I'm trying to do here is, I think, take a step further and not look at the cultural persistence, but instead ask if these ancestral ties matter for, lifetime basically transmission and change in cultural and political worldviews, real time, basically. So do we still have these cultural attention ties, and do certain events happening elsewhere affect us right now? Okay, and I actually document the importance of this, of certain shocks, be it events or attitudinal changes, which I broadly define as shocks. I will talk more about that. I document the importance of these kind of shocks for, in the ancestral countries, for changes in political and social attitudes of children of immigrants, okay? Living elsewhere, so for those who are not directly affected by these shocks, okay? So this is like the broad picture of this research. Okay, so as I said, this is very much an early stage project. So what I will show today is something I was able to do so far. I won't show everything, but I think the most interesting 3 parts are the following that I'm going to show today. So first, I will focus on Europe and show you how these second generation immigrants in Europe adjust their attitudes to corresponding attitudes in their ancestral homelands. Okay, so for example, as I said, like for example, second generation Hungarian living in Latvia, then attitudes change in Hungary due to an inflow of refugees. Am I affected? Maybe not. Let's see. Okay. Then I will go to, I would say, a more surprising set of results, whereby I document spillovers across the Atlantic. Okay. So I will show that basically people living in the US today, they are still affected by this refugee treatment in their ancestral homeland. Okay. And I will show that this effect is stronger for more recent immigrants, which I think makes sense. Okay. Then finally, I will show some suggestive evidence, not really, attempting to claim any causal effects there or whatnot, that basically social networks play a role. So namely, I will show that using the data from Facebook, that ancestral compositions of places, for example, of counties in the US, they are still very important for the extent of social connectivity between, for example, county I somewhere in, Minnesota, and connectivity with Sweden or something like that. Okay, so basically, the higher the ancestral share in a county of a given country in Europe, the more this county or other territorial unit will be socially connected to this place, which can suggest why do we see this cultural attention ties and why do we see this attitudinal spillovers. All right. This is something I'm going to show today. I'm still working on, additional, of course, to kind of to complete this puzzle, I think there are like many ways to complement what I have now. One of the ways to go is to look at the media coverage of these events. Because, for example, if a person lives elsewhere, there can be several ways that information and attitudes can basically spill over to him. One is that indeed he has certain types of social connectedness to this place, but the other can be that, for example, say me being like a German immigrant living in the US, I can just read German news, okay? And so I basically get like a somewhat similar exposure to people who are actually residing in Germany, okay? So, and if, you know, media in different countries cover events differentially, this can affect things, okay? And this can affect my attitudes as an immigrant living elsewhere, okay? Then I can focus on specific salient events and conduct a sort of event study analysis. So there were certain like very highly publicized events like the images of Alan Kurdi, like a little, like a baby basically who died in the Mediterranean, whose images were a very, this is like a shocking images basically, so I think I won't show them. And it was very, you know, it had a very strong effect on the discussion around the refugee crisis. And one can look at how these sort of salient events, or like Paris attacks, which were at some point attributed to refugees, or the New Year's Eve sexual assaults in Germany, how these salient events affect public perceptions of people living elsewhere. Okay, so this will allow me to basically conduct an analysis at a finer data, basically, because, well, we'll talk about that. All right, so I think if there are questions regarding like the broad picture, it's a good time to ask, or if not, you know, maybe clarifying questions or something. And if not, I will proceed.
Okay, I think all is good so far, Sasha.
That's great. Okay, so then regarding the literature, as I said, in principle, I hope that this project can contribute to this trend of research whereby people attempt to understand why, you know, right-wing trends and the trends in increasing polarization in Western Europe and in the US, why these trends are there, and can maybe part of these trends, as I said, can they be evolving along these ancestral lines? Can these spillovers contribute part to this trend? Then, of course, as I said again, the effects of the refugee crisis on these social and political attitudes are well explored, but mostly they are focusing on the direct effects in Europe. Not at all for spillovers, somewhat surprisingly for me, but again, if you know papers that are doing that, it's a good time to suggest to me because it's still an early stage. If I'm, you know, reinventing the wheel, I don't want to be doing that. Then, of course, this paper, I think, has a potential to contribute to this literature on the lasting effects of ancestral characteristics. So in this literature, as I was saying before, most often people do some sort of cultural persistence analysis. So for example, a certain, you know, historical attribute, like a geographic feature, for example, like in the paper by Galore and Ozak, contributes to, for example, the formation of a certain type of time preference. And then you document by looking at the second generation immigrants that this feature is kind of transmitted vertically within your family, within your ancestral group. But what I'm doing here is that I'm not looking at the vertical transmission. I'm kind of trying to look at the network type transmission. So basically asking, who is your relevant peer group? So maybe the relevant peer group from whom you learn is not only like your parents or something, but also people living in your ancestral country now. Okay, maybe you still have this cultural attention types. And because of this, of course, this paper is also related to literature on networks and peer effects. Okay, more like broadly defined. All right. Okay. So regarding the data, for these three types of results that I'm going to show today, I will be using mostly kind of, you know, aggregate data from the Eurostat and the UNHCR, data on the refugee inflows, and also some additional economic and socio-political controls. I will be using two sets of social survey data. For the European analysis, I will be using the European Social Survey, and for the US, I will be using the General Social Survey. So these are basically the two kinds of like data sources that people often use. So nothing new here. Yes, and I think the new input in this sort of analysis is this Facebook Social Connectedness Index. This is the recent measure made available by Johannes Strobel from NYU Stern. And this measure basically gives a connectivity between two geographic locations. Okay, so I will show in more detail how it's calculated, but basically it's like the number of friendships between any two locations divided by the maximum possible number of friendships given the Facebook usership in these two locations. Okay, so this is the measure of social connectivity between two places, and yeah, that's how it is. Okay, so let's go to the first set of results. Okay, so yeah, before I go there, just to give like an idea of what kind of variation in the refugee crisis and the inflows of refugees I'm using. So you can see like years 14, 15, 16, like outlined with these lines here. And you can see that certain countries like, Austria, well, not so much here, like Finland, Germany, Hungary, Sweden are experiencing these massive increases in the inflows of refugees. But certain countries, like not so much, like Romania, Latvia, for example, Ireland, Estonia are not, Belarus are not having this kind of refugees. So because of this, I will basically try to divide, countries into, higher, lower treatment groups and stuff like that. And importantly, I will be conducting the analysis also dividing, because they have two dimensions, right? You have like a host country and you have your ancestral country. And I think the most relevant exercise is to basically check whether you experience these attitudinal spillovers if your host country is not treated itself, okay? To kind of isolate this ancestral spillover mechanism, okay? And so this will help me in this regard, okay? So regarding the empirical strategy, it's not like, not a rocket science. I'm basically having this outcomes at the individual level. So for a person I living in social survey round T, living in region country R, and tracing his ancestry to country C. And the main treatment variable is this ancestral ancestral shock, which can be like, for example, a change in the attitudes in your ancestral country at time T, and or it can be the inflow of refugees itself. We can discuss like what kind of story is more interesting and how to generally think about it conceptually. And then like there are a bunch of fixed effects, time fixed effects, host country fixed effects, and importantly ancestral country fixed effects. All right, so the introduction of this ancestral country fixed effects basically allows me to, as I was saying, to take a step further compared to the standard, second generation migrant analysis, whereby it's usually not possible to introduce these ancestral fixed effects, okay, because their ancestral treatment measure is usually time invariant. So in my case, it will be time variant measure. Okay. All right. So a few things to say about this empirical design. So as I was saying, this has, of course, some ties to this network and peer effects literature. And at least since Mansky's famous works, there are several issues, of course, with these peer effects. And I think since 2 weeks ago, I think you had a seminar on peer effects. You probably know about that, but let's recap. So there are basically two main issues, which are various sorts of indigeneity concerns in this setup. And one is this so-called correlated group effects, okay, whereby basically two things are of concern. First is the endogenous selection of peers, okay? So this is a usual problem. So maybe you have this correlation between your peer group and yourself simply because you select peers who will react in the same way because they are similar to you along a host of characteristics. All right. In this context, importantly, like your peer group is basically exogenously assigned in a way. So your peer group is just your ancestral groups. I will also discuss something about your ethnic identity, okay? So basically, the extent to which you pay attention to your ancestral group can be endogenous, of course, and this will be harder to circumvent, but we'll talk about that later. The other problem, of course, is the reflection problem. So it's basically a simultaneity issue. So do I exert an influence over my peer group as well? Maybe not only them exert an issue on me, all right? But what helps in this context, of course, in the context of the refugee crisis, that in this context, the peers are affected by these external shocks, while the individuals basically on the left-hand side of the equation are not affected, or at least are less affected, okay? So this, again, helps to circumvent some of these issues. Also, I can be using lagged, basically ancestral treatment effects, which also helps. All right. Let's see some of the first suggestive evidence from Europe, okay? So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the question, whether immigrants make a country a better place, okay? And what is on the right-hand side is the answer to the same question, okay? Averaged across people in your ancestral homeland. So for example, as I was saying, you're, for example, a Hungarian second-generation immigrant, so your parents moved to Hungary some time ago. You lived there like for all your life, basically, so you're not an immigrant by yourself. And then I ask, basically, what is the effect, or maybe there is no effect, of what people think in your ancestral homeland regarding the same issue of immigration. And what we see is that basically, pulling all countries and all ancestries together, throwing these ancestral and time and regional fixed effects. So basically, we effectively are estimating here the effect of a change in the ancestral attitudes on the change in the local attitudes, okay? And what we see that basically there is a certain spillover, okay, from column 1. Importantly enough, this spillover becomes the strongest in the years of the crisis. So here I interact this treatment variable with the years of the crisis, okay? And what we see that overall there is not much, but when basically this issue becomes salient, there is a very strong and significant spillover effect. Okay, so basically you indeed have this cultural attention tied to what people think in your ancestral homeland. Okay, then what we also can do is that we can select countries, based on this graph. I can also do this, in a more rigorous way, not like binary separation, but a continuous, but it will be the same. So what I do here is that I do a split sample regression where I select only high exposure ancestral countries, okay? Countries which experience a high inflow of refugees in 2014-15. And what I see is that for these countries, for people who trace their ancestry to these countries, the effect is very strong, okay? But the effect is basically almost absent for countries that were not highly treated by this refugee crisis, okay? So it looks like this refugee crisis basically activates a certain attention ties to specific ancestries for which this issue is relevant, and in the time periods when this issue is relevant, okay? And this basically allows for this spillover to happen. The same thing, and even stronger, we can see for a different question, which is more relevant, I think, and more specific. So do we want to allow poor immigrants from outside of the European Union, which is directly basically affected to what was going on in these years? And we see basically the same set of correlations, but even stronger in magnitude. Or, well, maybe not stronger, just more significant somewhat. All right. So then let's do additional checks to ensure that this is not driven by local shocks and local changes in the attitudes. So specifically what I'm trying to do in this table, so look first at column 1. Here I will be looking at a subset of host countries which are not treated by themselves, okay? So this is a subset of European countries which do not experience a refugee crisis. You know, like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Scotland, Ireland, and I think Slovenia and Slovakia. I think this is the set of the countries, which basically neither hosted a lot of refugees and neither experienced like a lot of refugees passing through. Okay, so these are the countries which are basically somewhat unaffected by the crisis. And we see that even in this subset, even for these host countries, we still see this attitudinal spillover from your ancestral country, which again gets much stronger in the years of the crisis. Okay, so basically the whole effect is due to these years of the crisis. All right. Then what I do in columns 3 and 4, first, just to check on the whole sample, I introduce, this is like a very demanding specification, but I introduce an average change in the opinion in your region, so where you reside in your host country. And of course, this is a very strong effect. Well, because these people, this is basically a peer group which is nearby, which, you know, and so on. So probably it's reasonable to expect a higher correlation, but also it could be, you know, prone to a higher, you know, extent to these endogeneity concerns because you're exposed to a more common set of shocks and so on. So this is not the best control, but importantly enough, this attitudinal spillover survives even the addition of these local peer groups, okay? And the same for non-treated host countries, subsample, okay? And actually in this case, which I think makes sense, this attitudinal spillover has a much larger magnitude, basically because you are not directly exposed to this. So basically in terms of information processing, argument, the things that are happening in your ancestral country are more important to you because basically you do not have an alternative way of learning about these things because you are not directly exposed to the refugee crisis, okay? And then finally, I think an interesting and very meaningful interaction with the extent to which you actually follow political news, okay? So there is a measure of basically how interested you are in politics. Do you follow the news in various media and stuff like that? So I take a principal component of these things and I interact with the main treatment, with the ancestral attitudinal change. And what I see that basically for more apolitical people who do not care about political events and stuff like that, the effect, this attitudinal spillover is much, much weaker. Okay, and again, I think this adds to this argument that I'm trying to make that, again, if people basically care about these events, that this refugee crisis activates this attention ties, but this does not happen that much for people who basically do not keep attention, are not attentive to these events. All right. Okay. Oh yeah, and so the last thing for Europe that I want to say today is that here I take a different question, which was basically not at the top of the mind of people at this time period. So this is like a placebo exercise, okay? What do people think about immigrants same ethnicity as majority, okay? So this is not something that was basically in the agenda in this time period, okay? And we see that basically there is not much of an action, okay? So for this specific kind of attitude, there is not much of a spillover effect. So again, I think this suggests that this refugee crisis acts like a trigger that activates this ethnic attention ties, but only for places where these events are relevant, only in the time periods when this is relevant, and only for a subset of issues that are relevant in this time period. Okay. All right. So this is what I have for Europe. I think I should speed up a little bit. So I will, for the US, it's like a much more preliminary. So what I have here, like in Europe, I was able to basically regress an individual attitude on a corresponding average in his like or her ancestral homeland. Here, I try to do a different thing because I do not have in the GSS and the ESS like a exactly same questions. it will be harder to check this attitudinal spillover directly, but what I'm doing here is I'm checking actually the event spillover. Okay, so this is the direct refugee treatment in your ancestral homeland. So in the US, in the General Social Survey, people report their ancestries. And importantly, they also report the generation of their ancestry. So whether it's like their parents who migrated or their grandparents and so on. And what I see here, interestingly, is that if in your ancestral homeland, if your ancestral homeland experiences a larger inflow of refugees, basically people are becoming more conservative. People living in the US who trace their ancestry to these ancestries in Europe, they're becoming more conservative, okay? This effect is there for second and third generation immigrants. This effect becomes weaker in column 4 if I add fourth generation immigrants. And if I only look at the fourth generation immigrants, this effect is, well, very small, okay? Interestingly, there is heterogeneity with respect to the country of origin. So I cannot directly document why with the data at this point, but anecdotal evidence suggests that in the Germany, because of basically the character of both the attitudinal change and of the like media coverage and of the speeches of top politicians, the attitudes towards the refugees were much more positive than elsewhere. Okay, for example, Chancellor Merkel was like very positive and promoting this, you know, culture of openness towards the refugees in Germany. And apparently this is the reason why basically for Germany, for German Americans basically living in the US, there is an opposite effect. So they are becoming more liberal in their answers to these questions, okay? All right. But this is very preliminary for the US. I'm also conducting a different type of analysis where I will be looking at basically at the county level. So I won't be having individual responses, but I will be having voting for Trump in 2016 at the county level. And I also have an ancestral composition and connectivity of these counties with Europe, with various countries in Europe. And so what I'm currently doing is that I'm trying to test if indeed a change towards Republican votes from 2012 to 2016 is more pronounced in counties that are kind of more exposed to the crisis in terms of their ancestral composition, okay? And I'm finding some preliminary results, but some more work needs to be done there, okay? Yeah, so these are some alternative outcomes for the US. You know, people are becoming more conservative across a host of dimensions like poor help self, too much on social security, too much on welfare. People support these views basically if their ancestries are more exposed to the crisis. All right. Now, let me briefly touch upon this social connectedness index. So as I was saying, this Facebook measure allows me basically to check how connected are two geographic locations. So for example, take a county in the US and take a country in Europe, okay? Facebook basically allows you to measure the extent to which these two geographic units are connected in the following way. You calculate the number of friendship links between users in these two locations, okay? And you divide it here, for example, with the index that I'm provided with by the product of the number of users in these two places, okay? Which basically, and this is scaled basically to protect anonymity, okay? And this scaled measure gives me like a relative proportional, like whatever, relative probability of connectivity between these two geographic locations, okay? And then I go basically to the US Census, to the American Community Survey, and I also can get for each county in the US the shares of population who report their ancestry, like county A, B, C in Europe, whatever. And if the story that I'm trying to tell is true, then basically we can expect that if the story of social spillovers operating through the social networks is what's going on, we should basically expect that in places that, you know, have more Italians or have more Germans in the US or in other places in Europe, by the way, this should also work within Europe, not necessarily across the Atlantic. But anyway, if a certain place has a high share of, say, Italians, people who report their ancestry as Italy, we should expect this place to have a higher social connectivity to Italy. So is this true? Let's check it out. So here's, for example, a graph for Italy, okay? So what I have here is the share of people who report Italian ancestry on the x-axis. By the way, I zoom in here. So there are several outlier counties which have shares of Italian above 0.1, but I do not drop them. Here, I just zoom in to make it clearer, okay? And on the vertical axis, we have this social connectedness index from Facebook. So what we see here is a very strong, I would say, and I was personally surprised to see this dense connection between the share of Italian ancestry that you have and your connectivity to Italy at the county level, okay? So for example, like these counties, they have a very high share of Italians there, and they're also highly connected via Facebook to Italy. These counties have very low share of Italians, and they are not connected to it, okay? All right, and the same thing is observed if we pull all European countries for which I have ancestry in the census, and throw, you know, countries and counties fixed effects in this regression. So still, we see this very, very strong correlation, very dense correlation. Okay. Yeah. So I think this is at least suggestive that this kind of social ancestral spillovers can be indeed operating via these social ancestral ties, social networks. Okay. Of course, to prove this point more rigorously, I was thinking, for example, that one of the simplest exercises could be, you know, to take a collection of European countries, you know, save the slopes of these regression coefficients, or, you know, save the R-squared, and interact this R-squared with the treatment in this regression, something like that, as a very first step. And this actually works. So if I take, like, basically 4 countries that whose social connectivity with the US corresponds to the ancestral connectivity to a higher extent, for these countries, this ancestral treatment effect has a stronger, basically is more significant. Okay, but this is, of course, is just like, you know, just to probe this idea. I will have to think more about how to do it more rigorously. All right. Okay, here is just, you know, to illustrate like a potential way how to, so first to illustrate that people, you know, across the Atlantic actually do pay attention to these events. So this is the Google Trends Index of attention, okay? And there are 2 terms. One is refugees and the other is elections. Okay, you see, for example, that elections is the most important in this 2015-2016 time frame in the November 2016, well, for an obvious reasons, okay? But note that the term refugees is like more than half as Googled as the elections in the time of Trump versus Clinton election here in November 2015. So what happened there? Well, it was the time of the Paris attacks in November 2015. And we see that people who are not directly exposed to that still pay a lot of attention in the US to refugees. Why? Well, because initially refugees were, you know, somehow connected to these events. At least it was the perception in the media. All right. I think it was basically disproved later on, but at least this discussion was there. What is the second spike here in the early September 2015? Well, these are the images of Alan Kurdi, a little boy who died in the shores of Turkey. Okay. And we see that basically people in the US are suddenly paying much more attention to the issue of refugees. So one way to proceed with this sort of analysis with much more finer time frame is to basically explore these salient events and to try to see if a certain real-time measure of conservatism or real-time measure, for example, of support for Donald Trump or something like that, if these measures react to these salient events happening back in your ancestral countries, something like that. But this is still work in progress, okay? So I was not showing this today, but what I also do is that I try to see if the relevant peer groups are not just abstract, averages in your ancestral country, but maybe you pay attention to a specific subgroups in your ancestral country. For example, if you identify politically as, left, maybe you only pay attention to left-leaning people and left-leaning averages, broadly defined in your ancestral country. And this is like very much true. So, for example, people who identify as left only pay attention in the regressions of these kind of regressions, they only pay attention to averages across left-leaning people in their ancestral country. A bit less so for right-leaning people, by the way. So, and generally, by the way, if you identify as right-leaning, you do not pay that much attention for some reason, at least within Europe. So these ancestral spillovers are stronger for more liberal people. So I don't know why, but this is something to think about. Maybe simply because these people are different along other dimensions, like, use of social media or something like that. One other thing one can do is, as I was saying, to distinguish the mechanisms, okay? Because in principle, as I was saying, this could be this social connectedness, so people learn from their horizontal networks, and part of this network is still your ancestral homeland, okay? But maybe, for example, if you're like a German American living in the US, and Germany experiences this refugee crisis thing, maybe you just, you just are more exposed to this treatment compared to, I don't know, French Americans, because you simply are able to read German news and you do, watch German channels or something like that. And so you basically get closer to the type of treatment that Germany itself experiences. And it's not a network transmission. This is just a common shock effect. So basically, to distinguish between these two channels, I think it could be possible to conduct this media coverage analysis. And this is something that I'm trying to do these days, but this is still work in progress. Okay. All right. Yeah, I think I already said about that. So I'm also trying to look at certain salient events. Yes. Okay. All right. So yeah, I think I should stop here. I'm already out of my time, and that's what I have for today. Thank you so much, and I'm very much curious to know what you think. Thank you.
We'll let you know. Thanks very much, Sasha. Okay, please let us tell Sasha what we think. Questions, comments, suggestions. Let's see if there is anything in the chat. Okay, well, people are thinking what they think about what you presented.
If I could interject a bit.
Who is that?
With this, literature is that I'm not, I kind of always want to have a story about why is that economics. You know what I mean? So like, is that about information? Is that about some sort of costs? Is that about like, I guess, let me step back, and there is a literature on networks, right? So who is friends with whom, right? And that's important because we can show that there are networks and there is information dissemination, and that leads to inefficiency because people are in sparse network and you cannot, you advertise and nobody knows that you advertise because people don't tell each other, and word of mouth is important. And here is how you can,
all right, yes,
better spread of your information with better. But in here, right, what is the economic decision that I can do better by knowing that, immigrants from, if there is a region with more immigrants from Italy, they would like Italians more.
I see your question. Yeah, so if you take, for example, voting decisions, I mean, I guess there's no doubt that this is like both political and economic and social decisions, a very important one. So imagine, you know, you're a German American, okay, and you have, you know, I don't know, your mother living in Köln, okay, and then there is these sexual assaults happening on the New Year's Eve, and your mother tells you, you know, these immigrants and refugees, you know, they misbehave, so, you know, immigration is no good, you know, refugees no good. Then you go, you listen to Trump on Twitter, and you say, well, you know, maybe this guy is right, so I will go vote for Trump. So here you go, a very important network effect whereby these ancestral ties matter for a very important decision. So I think this could be part of the story. I do not show it now because, well, I'm still working with this voting data and related outcomes, but I think this is important. Does this answer what you're asking?
Let me put it like that. There is like in economics, there are referees, and referees like to have a reason to reject, right? And
there are plenty. I mean,
yes.
Sure.
So like, I don't see yet a good story about why is that a suitable thing for an economic journal. Come up with a thing.
Think more about this probably, yeah. I mean, again, it depends. I think it depends on what you call economics. Okay, I mean, if you call political economy economics, then here we go. If not,
absolutely. Can you use that information in political economy? Like, what do you need to do? Like, do you need to have different news for German intensive, you know, immigration regions and Italian intensive immigration regions? Like, if you're Trump, right? How do you get elected more? Do you go and complain about German stuff in German intensive region, and go complain about Italian stuff in Italian intensive region? Like, what? Like, if you want to do that story, then you need to have a story that you can get 3% more votes if you specialize your messages, right? So, like, if you want to go that way, you have to do something about it. Right now, I see you did a lot of work, and what I don't want to happen is that after you do a lot of work, you cannot do anything about it because, you know, you didn't find the right editor.
Okay, that's point well made. Well, in fairness, first, our seminar is multidisciplinary, and we also take papers that have to do with political science and so forth. And second, there's a good number of good economic papers on similar topics. ALGA, KU, inherited trust and growth, all of this epidemiological approach to norms and values, these are pretty much within economic mainstream, but these are certainly concerns that Sasha should keep in mind. Any other questions, please? Any other comments about the paper? Sasha, I would like to make a couple, if you don't mind. First, a concern that I have is that what you call exposure to the refugee. Can you hear me? Hello? Sasha? Can you hear me? I don't hear you. Hello?
Well, I can hear you, Leonid, but yeah, Sasha is probably not with us.
Okay, well, Sasha is probably having some connection problem. Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I do. All right. So
sorry. Yep.
You hear me, all right?
Yep.
So a concern that I have is that you talk about exposure to immigrants. This exposure, to a certain extent, in fact, to a very significant extent, endogenous to anti-immigration attitudes in the society. And some countries have very low exposure to immigrants precisely because there are very strong anti-immigrant sentiments. There are just 2 or 3 countries in Europe that opened up to immigrants. One is Germany, the other one is Sweden, and maybe a little bit the UK, but all others were quite skeptical. And therefore, low exposure, low arrival to immigrants might be, in effect, evidence of strong anti-immigration sentiments. And this is something that I would take in mind, I would keep in mind. How to do it, I'm not quite sure. One possibility is that instead of dividing your sample on low exposure, high exposure countries, you can take this exposure as a continuous variable and see what happens if you interact with this continuous variable. And secondly, also, I would probably also try to take the square of immigrants' arrival, because high arrival of immigrants probably suggests that there is, strong impact, strong shock on the society. Very low arrival of immigrants is also evidence that the society is very strongly anti-immigrant. And for that matter, you probably can expect some spillovers. So that's one suggestion I might have. Not sure if you want to follow it. Then another one is, you say to do diff and diff, but you take a very sort of aggregated approach before and after, right? But in fact, it was a continuous process, a continuous crisis, which unfolded over a number of years and which, as you said, had a number of spikes across the way. So maybe it might be a good idea to take, but on the other hand, you don't have ESS variables for every year. But to the extent that you do, maybe some other variables you can take. You can interact your attitudes with dummy variables for particular years of observation, not just before and after, but something in between. And you may also have to get more, so it's dynamic diff and diff rather than just, before and after in conventional way. Then some countries had low exposure, but in terms of arrival of immigrants, but they had very large transit flows of immigrants. And we're talking about Southern European countries mostly. It's Italy and Greece, and with some caveats, Austria and Hungary. And again, I would probably try to include these countries meaningfully in your analysis because they were strongly affected by this crisis. You might be able to observe. And finally, when you talk about the impact of social media, I would try to include another variable, and that is the effect that immigrants are exposed to mass media from their country of origin. That might be a strong factor for the attitude of Russian immigrants because they listen to Russian TV and so on and so forth, and that has very strong influence, especially in the Baltic states and Central European states. That is a strong factor affecting their attitude. So there are several dimensions, I guess, you can develop your story. But of those that I mentioned, the most important one, as far as I'm concerned, is that low exposure does not mean that the countries have not been affected by immigration. And in fact, it might be an indication of very strong anti-immigrant sentiments. And this is why there is low exposure. And you don't want to miss that effect. Sasha, we are not listening. We are not hearing you once again. You nod your head, and that's a good sign. You hear what I'm saying. But
can you hear me now?
Yes, we do. Right. Good.
I don't know what's happening. Sorry about that. Yeah, okay. I totally agree about this. All comments. Basically, it's super useful. I've been thinking about like this endogeneity, basically, of refugee inflow. As you say, of course, certain countries are more exposed non-randomly, but precisely because they are more open to refugees, and this can partly be reflective of the underlying attitudes. But note that the question that I'm asking is not exactly what is the impact of the crisis. This is about the spillovers. So for a given change in the ancestral country, and given the activation of attention triggered by the events, is there a spillover or not? So in a way, because if you live in a country that is not directly exposed to the crisis, this indigeneity concern that you raise is, at least to an extent, sidestepped. Not completely, I guess, but still, you are not directly exposed to the crisis, and still you're having some attention tied to your ancestral homeland. And as we see, these ties are very significant and strong. And so I thought that this design basically at least partly sidesteps this obviously important issue that refugee inflows are not randomly assigned to countries and regions. The other thing to do, and this actually I think can be related to your second point about the transition of refugees through certain places, right? Like Greece, Bulgaria, Hungary, and other places. That there were several routes, okay, through which people were going to Germany, Austria, Sweden, and other places. And maybe one could explore, maybe one could construct the instrument for the exposure based on the proximity to these routes. Because in principle, these routes are somewhat well known. Or even better, maybe one can construct like the least cost path or something like that. So like a potential route that you would take to get, you know, from the landing place in Greece or Italy to your most desired destination place. And using these kind of potential routes, one can basically instrument for the refugee exposure. So I was thinking about that, but it's just, you know, so far in my to-do list. But yeah, I agree. These are important concerns, that's for sure. That's for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, please? Any comments?
Yeah, I guess I have one. First of all, Sasha, thanks for a great talk. Like it was,
Sure.
I was very glad to see you again.
Yeah, same here.
And I have an impression that probably the main mechanism behind your results might be, in fact, assimilation, because I guess assimilation, this is precisely what drives both the decision like to follow news in your ancestral country and at the same time settle in the places where you like get more exposed to your like peers from the same country as well. And I guess like two pieces of evidence you present, like this like social connectivity index and like smaller effects for higher generation migrants. Like, they both like suggest that there should be something about that. Like, can you like probably like measure this in a way in maybe the US surveys, maybe like what language you speak in your like home, or like how does assimilation enters your story? What do you think?
That's a great question. This is again something that is in my very long, too long to-do list these days. And so there are several ways to go. The first one is to use data on so-called ethnic enclaves. So in the US, you can basically measure extent of ethnic isolation or ethnic segregation, if you wish, depending on which is the dimension. Is it a region or is it the ethnic group? So for ethnic group, you can measure ethnic isolation. So basically, what is the extent to which, say, Russian Americans are interacting with the rest of the American community in their city or in their county, in their state, and so on. So you can measure this thing in principle. And then the hypothesis could be that for counties or states or individuals, even if I can get this data, who are living in this kind of enclaves, meaning that they are not interacting much with the host community, maybe for them, these attitudinal spillovers should be expected to be higher, right? So this is something that probably you're suggesting. The other way to go is to look at, as you say, what language you speak or whether your parents intermarry ethnically or racially or something like that. So there is a host of measures of ethnic identity, basically. So there is, of course, a self-reported, ancestry, but this is not necessarily reflective of your identity. So you can simply know that you are, ethnic Russian, right, or something like that. But this is third generation, and already, your grandparent intermarried with American, and your parents are, American and I don't know, Jewish or whatever. And then it's like maybe your Russian identity is not so important for you anymore, and maybe for this kind of people we should not expect such a strong of a spillover, right? So yeah, for now I can say that just this is important. Probably the problem here is that this ethnic identity is endogenous itself. So if I were to throw in a simple interaction, this will be not so easy to sell, let's put it this way. So I need to think of ways of how to model it empirically. I don't know so far, because the extent of your ethnic identity again depends on the spatial arrangements of ethnicities in your county and your city, and on a on your income level probably, and on a host of other things. So yeah, I will be thinking about that.
Very good, thanks. Please. Other questions? Other comments?
May I ask a short question to Alexander?
Sure.
Yeah. So the question is about the strength of this effect for different subgroups of people in your general group. So As you know, some individual characteristics like gender, education, age, and so on, maybe you can find some other interesting story to what kind this effect is stronger or not for different subgroups of people to understand the main mechanism behind this effect.
Yes, yes, I agree. But just to clarify, do you mean characteristics at the level of the receiver or at the level of the sender, or like the bilateral, basically? Because in principle, yeah, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in my view, on the level of receiver, maybe, firstly.
So like, yeah, okay, if you're like more educated, or if you're, I don't know, if you're maybe younger, you may be, or I don't know, maybe not. You may be, you know, more involved in these social networks, for example, and because of this, you can be more susceptible to these spillovers, something like that.
Yes, that's right. So the general question is just about like persistence and change in cultural values. So in your own story, you are talking about like instantaneous changes. There is some particular shock, and my opinion and attitudes are changing very drastically. But there are like deep persistent factors like in culture, and maybe dividing by this subset of people, you can find like interesting story about your own effect.
No, this is something again that should be in my to-do list probably. For example, I can imagine that one such characteristic could be like the age of arrival in your host country, for example. So for example, if you arrived like a long time ago, like when you were a kid or something like that, then probably you're more integrated in the host community or something like that, and hence you're maybe paying less attention to what's happening in your ancestral country or something like that. Something like that can be done. Yes. What I already did on this line of reasoning is, as I was saying this. So yeah. So I was looking, for example, I was breaking down groups by ideology. Okay, so I was looking, for example, if you are left-leaning, do you pay attention, like on average, to opinions in your ancestral country, or to a specific subgroups, for example, people who identify as left-leaning in politics? And actually, this is true. So apparently, at least on this dimension, this kind of network homophily is very important. So you pay attention to people who are kind of similar to you. Okay, so yeah, I mean, again, this is in my to-do list, but yeah, I should do that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Very good. Any further questions, please? Comments? Okay, well, I think there are none. So all what remains to be done is to thank Sasha for his thought-provoking presentation. Come back again. We'll look forward to learning more about your interesting work. Bernardo, please, what's next conventional?
Thanks, Alexander, for joining us today. And
thank you for inviting.
And next week we have Francisco Cabrera. He's going to be presenting his work on his paper, Does Grading Bias Affect Indigenous College Students in Mexico? Evidence from a Field Experiment. So next Thursday, same time, same place. So we hope to see you all here next Thursday at 10:06 p.m. And thank everyone for joining.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll see each other again in a week.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, again, for listening and for comments. It's very, very useful, especially at this stage. And yep, see you soon.
Perfect. See you soon. Bye-bye.